In this video, we will be describing the supply and demand model, the fundamental model of microeconomics. We will discuss the factors that influence supply and demand, and we will discuss how to use the supply and demand model to determine what happens to equilibrium price and quantity when the factors change. We'll also discuss the role of prices in moving markets towards equilibrium in the event of a surplus or shortage. Supply and demand is the fundamental tool of microeconomic analysis. You will use it many times throughout the rest of this course, analyzing all sorts of different types of market situations. So it's really important that you focus hard on these important concepts now. Throughout this video, there will be chances for you to pause and practice what you've learned through questions that will appear on the side. In a market, remember, there are two types of economic agents: buyers and sellers. From earlier in the course, we defined an economic agent as a rationally self-interested decision maker. So remember always that both buyers and sellers are acting in their own rational self-interest. Since buyers and sellers are independent agents, we need to separate out in our market model the behavior of buyers and sellers and consider each side separately. So we'll begin with the demand side of the market and then continue with a similar discussion of the supply side. Our fundamental definition in the demand side of the market is quantity demanded. Quantity demanded is a variable that tells me the amount of a product that a group of consumers are willing and able to purchase at various prices. We use quantity demanded as part of the demand function. Demand is a function that explains how various market factors influence the amount of a product that consumers are willing and able to purchase. We can break virtually any situation in a market down into one of the following 6 demand factors or exogenous factors that affect demand. Those would be the price of the product. We generally assume that the higher the price, the lower the quantity demanded. Consumer income is important. For most goods, as income rises, demand rises as well. We call those normal goods, but for some goods, as income rises, demand can actually fall. Think of ramen noodles, used cars. These goods we call inferior goods. Tastes and preferences represents just about any external factor that affects how consumers feel about a particular product or class of products. Think about Meghan Markle, the Duchess of Essex. If she's seen in a Stella McCartney gown, then the next day Stella McCartney is definitely in high demand. That's a change in consumer tastes and preferences. The number of buyers is important in determining how much is purchased. The more buyers, obviously, the higher quantity demanded. Expectations represents any beliefs about the future that the group of consumers possess. We might, for example, have expectations about future prices. Consumers might think that prices are going to rise or that prices are going to fall, and that could affect their consumption, their purchases today. Likewise, you might think that your income is going to be higher or lower in the future, and that might affect your demand for a product today. And finally, the price of related goods. There are 2 types of related goods when we think about consumers. Those are goods that we use with the product in consideration. So think peanut butter and jelly, coffee and cream, gasoline and automobiles. We call these complements in consumption, goods that consumers use together. Or there are other goods that we use instead of some particular good. Walking versus taking the bus, chicken versus pork, soda versus juice. These would be substitutes in consumption. So this is a very complex function. There are 6 different independent variables that affect our dependent variable quantity demanded. It would be very complicated to always be thinking about shifts in all of these different independent variables. So economists generally focus on one much simpler relationship. That is, we focus on the relationship between quantity demanded and price while holding all of the other exogenous or independent variables constant. We call this the ceteris paribus assumption. Ceteris paribus just means all else equal or everything else constant. This allows us to examine the one important relationship between price and quantity demanded, while for the moment holding everything else constant. Since this is only a two-dimensional function, we can draw pictures very easily. For example, this picture is what we call a demand curve. It's just a graph that shows that relationship between price and quantity demanded, ceteris paribus, holding everything else constant. You can see in this graph then, when the price is $8, this group of consumers would demand 400 units of this product. If the price falls to $6, then this group of consumers would demand 600 units of this product, and so on. We could also create a simple algebraic expression to reflect the same relationship. We call that a demand function. But this is exactly the same relationship. If we put 8 in for price here, 8 times 100 would be 800, 1200 minus 800 would be 400 units. So when price is $8, consumers demand 400 units. If we put 6 in for price, 6 times 100 is 600, 1200 minus 600 is 600 units, and so on. So these really are just different ways of looking at the same relationship between price and quantity demanded. Here's a question for you. What's the direction of this relationship? That is it positive or negative, direct or indirect, between price and quantity demanded? That's good. This is a negative relationship, or indirect or inverse relationship, and it's one of the most important in microeconomics. It's what we refer to as the law of demand. That is, that when prices rise, quantity demanded falls, and when prices fall, quantity demanded rises, ceteris paribus, holding everything else constant. Our demand curves will always have negative slopes. Now, don't think that we're ignoring all of those other factors that affect demand. We can still use our demand curves or demand functions to consider what happens when one of the non-price determinants changes. For example, this simply means that not just one price will quantity demanded change, but if one of the non-price determinants changes, it means that consumers will change their behavior at every price. We refer to this situation as a change in demand. Let's look at a simple example. Consider, for example, a change in consumers' tastes and preferences. Let's say that this is a good for which consumers suddenly want more of it, because again, maybe we saw our favorite celebrity using the product. This would mean that no matter what the price, whether it's $8 or $6 or $4, quantity demanded would now be higher than it was before. So that means the new demand curve, a new demand curve, would lie to the right of the old demand curve. So regardless of the price, quantity demanded is higher. The whole curve shifts to the right, and that's what we refer to as an increase in demand. Now let's turn our attention to sellers in the market, the producers, and the supply side. We can think about this in exactly the same sort of way. We'll start with a definition of the variable quantity supplied, which is the amount of a product that producers are willing and able to offer for sale at various prices. Again, notice this is desired sales. It's what they're willing and able to offer for sale. It's not actual sales, just like demand was desired demand. And again, we can think about quantity supplied being a function of various independent or exogenous variables. In the case of supply, these are price. Firms, being profit maximizers, would, everything else constant, want to sell more of a product if they can sell it for a higher price. The next two both have to do with the cost of production. The first is input prices, how much you pay for the labor and raw materials and capital that go into production. If it costs more to produce your product, because these things are more expensive, then everything else constant, you would want to produce less. T represents technology, which also has to do with the cost of production. If technology increases, that means we need fewer inputs per unit of output. I need less labor. I need fewer hours on the machine to produce my output. So an increase in technology would lower the cost of production, thus meaning that firms would desire higher quantity of sales. N represents the number of sellers in the market. Again, more sellers, everything else constant, should imply that there's a larger quantity supplied. E represents producer expectations. Just like consumers, Producers may have beliefs about the future. They may think that the price of their product will rise or fall, or that the cost of production will rise or fall in the future, and that may affect how much of a product they wish to offer for sale now. There are likewise also related goods on the producer side. There are substitutes in production. Those would be goods that producers can produce instead of something else. If you're an automobile manufacturer, for example, you might be able to produce a coupe or a sedan on the same assembly line from roughly the same products or inputs. Those would be substitutes in production. Complements in production are goods that are produced together. They're effectively byproducts. When you make the one good, you automatically make the other. Think donuts and donut holes. And finally, there's taxes and subsidies. Taxes and subsidies affect the cost of production as well, but they're external to the firm. These are imposed by government. Taxes increase the cost of production, subsidies reduce the cost of production. Thus, taxes reduce quantity supply, subsidies increase quantity supply. And again, just like the demand function, this is an extremely complicated relationship that would be difficult to analyze with all of these different independent variables. So we focus on the important relationship between price and quantity supplied, while again assuming that all of the other factors are ceteris paribus, that is, held constant. And again, this allows us to think about a two-dimensional picture of the relationship between price and quantity supplied, which we refer to as a supply curve. Again, if price is $8, this supply curve shows me that this group of producers would want to sell 1,000 units. If price falls to $6, this same group of producers would now want to sell only 800 units, and so on. Similarly, this algebraic expression shows that same relationship between price and quantity supplied. When price is $8, this group of producers would want to sell 800 plus 200, 1,000 units, and so on. So once again, these are just two different ways of looking at the same relationship between price and quantity supplied. What's the direction of this relationship? Is it positive, that is direct, or is it negative, that is indirect? That's right. This is a positive relationship, a direct relationship between price and quantity supplied. We often refer to this as the law of supply. Price and quantity supplied are directly or positively related, ceteris paribus. Again, this doesn't mean that we're going to ignore those other factors that affect quantity supplied. It simply means that when one of those other factors, like input prices or technology, changes, we have to consider that the producer's behavior will change at every price, not just one price. This is the situation that we refer to as a change in supply. Again, let's look at an example. Let's say, for example, that input prices fall, wages perhaps, or the cost of an essential raw material. This would imply that producers would want to sell more of the product no matter what the price. If the price is $8, they no longer want to sell 1,000, they now want to sell more. If the price is $6, they no longer want to sell 800, they now want to sell more. So this implies that the new supply curve, again, lies to the right of the original supply curve. This is what we call an increase in supply. By the way, be very careful with this. Because the quantity axis is on the horizontal, and the quantity axis is where we're measuring our output, the curves in demand and supply models shift to the right when they are increasing, and they shift to the left when they are decreasing. Don't think in terms of up or down, or you will get confused. We now know enough to put all of this together, our demand and supply, our consumer and producer side of the market. Market equilibrium is the situation in which the desires of firms and the desires of buyers match one another. In other words, when quantity demanded, the amount of the good that a group of consumers are willing and able to purchase, equals the amount of the good that a group of producers are willing and able to offer for sale at a particular price. Market equilibrium then is the price at which quantity demanded and quantity supplied are equal to one another. It's an ordered pair in the words of algebra. In other words, you need to both specify a quantity 10 units of output, and a price, $1. Never, ever, ever say supply equals demand. Remember, supply is the entire relationship between price and quantity supplied. It's that whole curve, or it is the entire algebraic expression. Likewise, demand is the whole relationship between price and quantity demanded. It is the whole curve, the whole algebraic expression. Demand and supply can't equal one another. Demand is a negatively sloped line. Supply is a positively sloped line. They're only equal at they only intersect in one and only one point, and that's the market equilibrium. So this intersection point between demand and supply is market equilibrium. It's the price-quantity combination where quantity demanded and quantity supplied are equal to one another. Now let's think for a minute about what happens when markets are not in equilibrium. Consider, for example, a price that is above the market equilibrium price. So a price that is up here above the intersection point between the demand curve and the supply curve. What's going to happen in a market in a situation where price is set somewhere above market equilibrium? We call that situation a surplus. When quantity supplied is greater than quantity demanded at a given price, the market is in surplus. If you were a seller, at the end of the day, you'd have output left over because you've offered for sale more than consumers are willing to purchase. What would you do? You would lower your price. And as price in this market falls, two things happen. On one side, consumers increase their quantity demanded. We move down along the demand curve. And as price in this market falls, producers decrease quantity supply. They offer less and less for sale. So day after day, as price starts to fall, we would see the size of the surplus shrink. And it would continue to shrink. Price would continue to fall until price reaches that equilibrium price. At that point, no one has any incentive to lower their price because they can sell everything that they want to, everything that they're offering for sale at that price. What about the opposite situation? What if we had a price that was below the market equilibrium price? What if we had a price down here below the intersection point? What do you think would happen? This is the situation that we refer to as a shortage. That is a price where quantity supplied is less than quantity demanded. Imagine being in such a market. Lots of people line up to buy the good, and not as many units as people want are offered for sale. What would you do? What do you do if there aren't tickets to the concert you really want to go to? You bid higher and higher prices. I offer a higher price and a higher price. And as price starts to rise, again, two things happen in this market. Some consumers drop out of the market. Quantity demanded falls. We move up along the demand curve. And as price rises, new producers enter the market, or producers offer more for sale. Quantity supplied rises. And again, price will continue to rise. The size of the surplus will shrink until eventually we restore market equilibrium. So we say for this reason that market equilibrium is a stable equilibrium. If something happens that knocks a market away from the market equilibrium price, we would expect it to return to that equilibrium price all by itself over time. Now let's think about supply and demand analysis. How can we use this supply and demand model that we have built in order to analyze events in a market? This is an important task, but if you approach it in a very step-by-step way, you'll find that these problems are quite easy. I'm going to outline the steps for you, and then we're going to work through a couple examples where we'll stop and you'll get to answer the questions as we go. The first thing we want to do is identify the market and draw our supply and demand graph. It's always a basic X. Supply is the upward sloped line, demand's the downward sloped line. We indicate the initial equilibrium price and quantity, and label what the good is that we're talking about so we all know what we're talking about. So here's the market for economy cars, for example. The next thing we want to do is we want to determine, from the situation we've been given to analyze, whether demand or supply is going to be affected by the change. This is where it's important that you remember those 5 items that we talked about, the non-price determinants of demand, and those 6 items that we defined as the non-price determinants of supply. You'll need to be able to identify whether the scenario falls into one of the situations on the left, demand shifters, or one of the situations on the right, supply shifters. Once you know whether demand or supply is affected, you want to figure out in this particular case, is demand going to increase or decrease? Is supply going to increase or decrease? Given that, we can draw a new supply or demand curve, shifting it to the right if it's an increase, to the left if it's a decrease, and then determine the new equilibrium price and quantity. Now let's think about some examples. What would be the impact on the market for luxury cars of an increase in consumer income? Step by step. Step 1. Will this affect demand or supply? Good. Consumer income is one of the demand shifters. It was on the left-hand side of our previous page. Will an increase in income cause demand to increase or decrease? Since luxury cars are likely to be a normal good, this increase in income is going to lead to an increase in demand. How do we show this then on our demand and supply graph? An increase in demand is going to shift the demand curve to the right. And what impact did that have on market equilibrium price and quantity? An increase in demand causes an increase in equilibrium price and an increase in equilibrium quantity. So what is the impact on the market for luxury cars of an increase in consumer income? Demand increases, causing equilibrium price and quantity to rise. Let's consider one more example. What's the impact on the market for automobiles and the increase in a price of steel? First, will this affect demand or supply? That's right. Steel is an input. It's needed to make automobiles. So this is a supply shifter. The change in the price of steel will affect the cost of production. Will this increase in an input price cause supply to increase or decrease? Excellent. An increase in input price causes a decrease in supply. Higher cost of production means producers would want to produce less of the product. Finally, how do I show this graphically? A decrease in supply is going to shift the supply curve to the right. Left. Shift the supply curve to the left. That's a decrease in supply. And finally, what impact will that have on market equilibrium price and quantity? The new market equilibrium is going to be at a higher price and a lower quantity than before. So what's the impact on the market for automobiles of an increase in the price of steel? Supply decreases, that is, the supply curve shifts to the left, and equilibrium price rises and equilibrium quantity declines. I hope these examples have helped. There's many, many more practice problems in the text and on the course shell, and you have many chances to ask questions and practice with your teammates in the class on such problems. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask. Thanks for listening.